Alrighty, so thank you guys for making the time to chat tonight. I say chat, we're going to go through a bit of a presentation style workshop. I shouldn't keep you for much more than 45 minutes, but I am free after the time. If there's questions and stuff, we can hang around and go through them for whoever's free. So tonight we're going to chat about effective session design. In terms of an agenda, we're going to go through the components of a session. So that's not just kind of simply telling you what the parts are, it's going through what those parts should really look like. It's applying some of the knowledge from kind of Canada Soccer, Ontario Soccer best practices, so that you understand basically what the standard is throughout the country. We'll go into what SMART sessions are, which might be fairly familiar, or the acronym SMART might be familiar for a lot of you, but we're actually going to look at how we can apply that acronym to our session plans. And then we'll go through a little bit about organisation and preparation, which, although a little bit more dull, is really your best friend and will probably help you out the most of any parts we talk about. So without further ado, we'll hop into the components of a session. So really, when we go through the whole session tonight, it's about giving you tools that you can use in your own sessions. So the intent of this is not to just hand out session plans. I've been asked for session plans in the past. I've asked other people for session plans whenever I was a younger coach. It's just difficult. If you get somebody else's session plan and you try to run it, you're not always 100% sure what you're doing or what their intent was when they designed the session. So the entire purpose of tonight is to give you the tools you need to make something that makes sense to you and that you're comfortable delivering. So I will give you references and templates and things you can go and use, but really the point in learning tonight is so that you're empowered to go and do it yourself. So in terms of the components of a session, you've obviously got these 4 overarching areas that you all should be fairly familiar with. They can be further subdivided. So you've got your warm-up in 3 different parts. So you've got continuous movement, neural prep, and technical prep. And we'll dive a little bit deeper into each of these so that we can explain essentially what they're about. And there's some really great resources that Eunice has put together that I'll be sharing after as well. So you can kind of see some more kind of standardized warm-ups and pick ideas from those. Then we'll talk about games. So you've got your small-sided and your full-size games. You can put constraints on games. Games essentially are the player's favorite part of a session, usually. Then we'll go through activities. So activities are essentially anything that's not one of these other 4 elements. So if it's not a warm-up, if it's not a game, and it's not a cool down, it's probably an activity. So the reason I've called it activities is because really when you do get into some of your licensing stream, and if you want to go and do further coach education with Ontario Soccer, you'll be totally chastised if you walk in the room and you start talking about drills. I've put a little emoji of a screwdriver there because there is not a power drill emoji, but to get the point across, drills are seen as like it's a very kind of militant language to use. So something very structured and regimented. That's not what we're going for. And that's basically the lingo that we want to stamp out. And that's kind of the going thing throughout Canada Soccer. So as much as possible, you could try to refer to them as activities rather than drills. If you don't plan to go do any further licenses, you're welcome to interchangeably use them. And then finally the cool down. So not to be forgotten about, cool down is really important for lots of reasons, and we'll dive into it a bit deeper later on in the session, but ultimately about lowering your heart rate and your body temperature. It prepares the players for their next session, and it's a really great opportunity to actually socialize and discuss a little bit. Okay, so before we dive into the parts themselves, I'm going to challenge you. So we're going to use Mentimeter. I don't know how many of you have actually used this before, but I will paste the link in the chat. Or you can use the QR code, hop on your phone and go to this page. I'm going to have 2 different questions and that's it, because I tried to do breakout rooms last night for the CITs and it was a bit of a technical snafu. So if you can hop on over to that, the first question you're going to see is, as a player, your favorite part of the session. So I'll start sharing the results as they, I'll just stop sharing the presentation. And here we go. So as the parts come in, remember you're wearing your player hat. We already have games pulling out into the lead. Not massively. Somebody likes warm-ups, all right.
Can you place the link?
Sorry. Yeah, I did say I was going to do that, didn't I? I can. See, I said I could place the link, but can I really? Social experiment. Okay, so we've got lots of people as a player are loving games. That would be my preference too if I took a vote on this. We've got 4 people that like activities and drills, and we've got 1 person that as a player is a fan of warm-ups. Oh, still coming in, perfect. Okay, so overwhelmingly supportive of games. This is the big one. The next question I'm going to ask you is, as a coach, what is your favorite part of the session? But I want you to bear this in mind. We've got almost 3 times, well, we've got more than 3 times as many player hats that prefer games to activities, drills. Nobody likes conditioning. Nobody likes to cool down, and 1 person likes to warm up, potentially more for its social side. So the next one I'll ask you in the same link, I'd like you now to respond and say, as a coach, what is your favorite part of the session? So do you like to deliver one part of the session any more than another part of the session? Oh man. Okay, so this is an awesome social experiment and is totally what I expected would come through. So as coaches, probably our favorite part of the session, again, nobody likes to cool down. Pay attention to that. 1 person likes conditioning. I'm going to guess that might be Eunice. And then we got a whole bunch of people that love to coach activities or drills. We don't like to coach the game. So bear that in mind. We've got stacks of player heads that love games, and we got stacks of coach heads that love activities or drills. So just keep that in mind as we go through the rest of the presentation, and we'll have a quick chat about it when it comes up. So you can exit Menti. I'll actually share the results with you when we're done, but for now we're going to hop back into the presentation. So thank you for participating in my social experiment. Okay, so now that we've done the Mentimeter, we're going to hop right in and we're going to talk about kind of the standard format that Canada Soccer adopts for sessions. So as soon as you get into kind of your community level coaching streams, you'll get exposed to what's called kind of a GAG methodology. So that comes within Canada Soccer standard format for a session. So you go through a 3-part warm-up, which we'll dive into deeper. Then you actually go into a game. So as soon as your warm-up's done, what they're saying is you go straight into a game, but this game is for coaching, okay? So what this basically tells you is you've got to be pretty darn prepared coming into your session if you're going to come out of a warm-up straight into a game and start coaching, okay? So bear that in mind. Once you've done the first game, you're going to go into an activity or an analytical, and then after that, you're going to go into a game, which is purely for observing, and then you'll kind of finish everything up with a cool down. So I'm not sure if anybody would have heard of the whole part whole method for skill acquisition, but basically this is kind of a derivative of that. So the whole is the game that you start with. You break it down into loads of parts, which is your activities, your analyticals, and then you go back to the whole. So the idea here is that you coach the player in their first game, you get all your coaching points out, then you go into your activity where you break it down, and then in your final kind of observing game, that's where you see if there was learning. So are the players showing what you'd hoped they would after you'd done the first few parts of your session? Okay, so that, just to make you aware of, is kind of a standard format that you'll see if you go on to pursue any further coaching qualifications. In terms of the warm-up, unit really great resources that I've attached to this. I'll talk a little bit more soccer focused, and Eunice is really physical preparation, and it's excellent stuff that you should be familiar with. I'm probably not as familiar as I should be, which is why I'll speak to kind of the soccer warm-up side of it. But the 2 ideas, ramp, raise, activate, mobilize, potentiate, is kind of synonymous with the soccer approach of the 3-phased warm-up, where they call it continuous movement, neural preparation and technical preparation. So through your warm-up and the CITs who are on the call, you'll probably have a connection made with the session we did last night on the 4 corners. Through your warm-up, it's really easy and it's a good opportunity to connect some of those lesser used 4 corners. So for example, your social and your physical. So when you get out into the warm-up part of your session, it's really a great opportunity for you to build a rapport with the players, but also the players to kind of get to know each other, let them have that little bit more freedom perhaps in the warm-up. Maybe there's some teamwork elements you can build into it. And it just makes it that much easier to kind of touch on the social and kind of emotional side of things before you even get cracking into the rest of your session. So the 3 phases broken down, you've got your continuous movement. So really that's lots of multi-directional movements, using a dynamic range of motion, but it's all about raising your heart rate, raising your body temperature. The little image I've put in there is one that I choose to use myself, but you absolutely don't have to have a ball. I really like to do my continuous movement warm-ups or the piece of my warm-up with a ball, and that's where I build in some of my ball mastery. So it's lots of changing of directions. The players will move around on the ball pretty much continuously. You just kind of have to ensure that they continue moving and it's getting to where you want it to with that continuous movement. But you absolutely don't have to include a ball in this part of your warm-up. One of the other ones that I would use fairly frequently would be to put down cones of different colours, and then you'd have the players work doing different movements between a colour pattern, say blue, yellow, orange. Players would work in that colour pattern. Maybe they're doing jogs, butt kicks, side steps, you name it. You can really kind of build it in and make it age appropriate and engaging as possible. So with that ball mastery warm-up, probably I would go for 11, U11 plus. I would be more inclined to use that because anywhere below that, the players tend to not have the best ball mastery and it can kind of break down the intent of the continuous movement. Neural preparation. So second part of your 3 phase, this is really about building those brain connections for quick movements. So lots of coordination, quick feet, and you can associate it to your session. So usually you'll see the cones come out at this point in time. I wouldn't beat a dead horse with this one. Probably neural preparation could be done in 5 minutes, thereabouts. The overall length of your warm-up, the advised time for these 3 phases is about 1/3 of the length of your session, believe it or not. So if you're running a 60-minute session, recommendation is run 20 minutes of warm-up, but given it's broken down into 3 parts, it makes it a little bit more digestible than just the warm-ups of old, where you would run laps around the pitch and you're imagining yourself running laps for 20 minutes. That's not what we're going for. So one way in which you could associate this to a session, for example, if you're working on defending in your session, you might be able to build in jockeying movements or appropriate kind of movements that you'd like the players to execute in through your movement pattern through the cones. And then technical preparation. So this is done with the ball. You're getting closer to play, and it's often competitive. And again, I would recommend if you associate it to the session intent, that's kind of the best way to go about it. So the example I've used in here is one that I would use for my teams in their warm-up for games. I'd put 3 different coloured bibs, or teams in 3 different coloured bibs, each with a ball to begin with. They just possess within their own colour. Then whenever they're kind of done with some of that easier non-competing stuff, you'll take 2 of the balls out, you'll have 1 ball, and you'll work 2 teams against 1 team. So obviously you'd expect the 2 teams combined to be possessing the ball a little bit more than the 1 team who doesn't have the ball. But totally can work in whatever kind of element of this technical prep, but really it's with the ball and you're getting closer to that level of play that you'd expect in a game. And then we get to games. So don't need to harp on this one a lot because games, as we know, are pretty, it's the fundamentals. That's what we're here for. We're here to play soccer. It is a game itself. So you can look at it a few different ways. You've got small-sided games where you'd break down. We've all played small-sided games. Sevens, O-Town Sevens, for example, that's a small-sided game. You've got 5v5s. You can really jig up the numbers to get to whatever desired outcome you want. Your full-size games, dependent on the age group. So for some of the CITs on the call, that would differ depending on the age. So for example, the U11 players would be transitioning from a 7-a-side game into a 9-a-side game the following year, that kind of thing. With constraints, so you can put all kinds of constraints on your games, whether it's, well, I won't get into that actually, because we plan to have a whole workshop kind of based on constraints, and hopefully we'll be able to do that out on the pitch, save us all from this virtual learning stuff. You can manipulate the games to emphasize your coaching points. So you can actually get pretty lost when you're designing sessions, because you get thinking about it and you get thinking about your game and you go, okay, I really want to affect this player. How can I make sure that player sees lots of the ball in the game? Or how can I make sure that player finds himself in this situation a few different times? So you can get quite into it if you think a lot about it. And then coaching through games. So barely any of us said that the game was our favorite part of the session and that we love coaching activities. Yet with our player hats on, players love games. So straight away, there's kind of an imbalance, right? So we have players that love games, but we have coaches that love to coach activities. At the end of the day, yes, we're here to develop as coaches, but the players come first and we're trying to develop them. And to be honest, some of the best coaches that you'll encounter are those who can coach through a game. So for me, coaching through a game is the toughest way to coach. You have to have a really high IQ. You have to be able to soccer IQ, I should say. You have to be able to pick out kind of moments in time that are good for coaching a particular player. You've got to have a really solid technical and tactical understanding and see the big picture, not just that ball carrier, right? So it's fairly easy in a controlled environment, like an activity, to coach a player. But once you get into a game, that environment is not something you're going to be able to control as a coach. So you can only really teach through communicating with the players and kind of showing them again through the game. So really would encourage most of you to have a look and see how you can enhance your coaching through games. Into activities. So activities are often the technical and tactical focal point of a session. So you'll see in the picture, I did select the picture for a reason. We've got 3 kids who are just standing, 2 of which have their hands on their hips. There's 1 kid with a ball and the rest are just hanging back. So I've learned that this has been called a line drill. So basically, the idea that I want to get across to you through talking about activities is that we want to maximize the learning of the players. It's not about maximizing our coaching time. We want to maximize the player's ball time, their time on the ball, and their learning. So through standing watching, there's some instances where totally this could work. Just I think to really hone your skill at coaching, to get away from this as much as possible, unbelievable. So really activities you should imagine as kind of magnified portions of the game. So if you were to look at a match scenario, maybe it'll be in the new Super League, who knows? If you were to look at a match scenario and just kind of pinpoint and magnify part of that, could you turn that into an activity? So I've said also these really need to be smart, which again, we'll get to in a couple of minutes about what a smart session is. But ultimately it looks like a game of soccer. It's not like a regime, basically. And usually activities are where we allocate a lot of time in our sessions. And I kind of imagined the results in the Mentimeter would go the way they did, because we like to coach, we're there to coach, and we'll devote a lot more time probably to what we like to coach, which is why I would imagine activities holds such a large chunk of our session. So I would just put to you, try not to get sucked into overcoaching, but be fairly self-aware. So in terms of what activities can be, so you can have anything from your 1v1s, 2v2s, 3v3s, you can mix up numbers, 6v4, you can go really with whatever. Activities for me are the one spot that you can be really, really creative in what you do with your session and how you get through to specific players that you're trying to target with coaching points. Technical training is a lot about breaking down technique, but within a game-like situation. So you've got to make it development appropriate. And technical, I would say, is definitely more focused on the individual within the training session. So if it's their passing technique, I might go out to a pitch and see a whole session of kids lined up passing back and forth in pairs. Is there another way you could do it to make it as effective, if not more effective? Because once the kids get into a game and they're passing, they're not standing and passing back and forth to each other, they're moving, they're maybe having to play a reverse pass, they're having to adjust their feet. Just how can you make it that much more like a game? Tactical training and awareness. So this kind of touches on more players and their individual role, responsibility, and understanding within a team setting. So it's not to be confused with tactics proper, but it's to kind of understand the game and where you might apply some of the techniques that you've done in the technical training part. You might also touch on moments of the game, so transitions, you're in possession, out of possession, dead ball. I don't imagine we'll see too many DSP sessions that are focused on dead balls, free kicks. If we do, don't let me know. Principles of play, you've got your depth, width, attacking and defending principles. And then as kind of a last note, before I show you a couple examples, I'd recommend you have a progression in mind. So it's a little bit off as to whether you'll have to actually use the progression. But basically, you want to have that in mind. So if the players pick up what you're putting down really quickly and they're having a whole bunch of success, you want to have that next step that will challenge them that much more without you having to go to a whole different activity, say. So I kind of put it as like use in case of fire. You would use it in case the players have too much success and you want to give them that little bit extra challenge. So that progression could be anything from changing the number of players, changing the angle of approach of a defender, say. You can really manipulate the activities quite well, and just get creative with it. I see a question, so I'm going to pause. Graham, do you think coaches like activities more because we have a lot of control in activities versus games? Where we're coaching, we see that it's the best way players to learn, not that this assumption is true. Yes, so I would say, I think I've already touched on this, and that might have been a question from a while ago, but I would say totally. I'd say coaches like it more because we have lots more control. It might be easier for us as coaches to have more activities and it might look better to parents and onlookers, but ultimately, if it looks chaotic, the kids come off the pitch with their faces a bit red, and sure, it didn't look like it was totally in control. To me, the kids probably had a better time if they come off, had a bit of chaos, and actually learned and used a few more realistic soccer actions in the games. So good question, thank you. Activities examples. So like I said, I'm not trying to throw any templates or session plans down your throat, but these are just a handful. So for example, in the first one, you've got a 3v3 plus 3. So I might have the black team are currently in possession, so they're playing with the white team on the outside. The white team can send either of their players to that free side, so they have to move a little bit more. If the red team wins it, obviously it turns to a 3v3 possession the other way. Similarly, down here, I have one that I'd focus a lot and involve the goalkeeper a lot, so we get lots of shots on goal. So inside the 18-yard box, I'd have a 3v3. Whatever team is in possession can go to goal, but if they turn over possession, so say the Reds have a shot here, ball turns over possession to the black team has to take the ball and use one of the white players before they can go to goal. So it's a little bit more realistic. So imagine the red team's just had a shot, or it kind of is more realistic to the transition moment where you wouldn't just find yourself free in front of goal with the ball. You might have to circulate it to find that freedom to get a shot off. And then we've just got kind of a phase of play up at the top. So activities, again, would encourage you, have fun with it. And the more chaos, probably the better, especially with those younger ages. And one thing I should say is don't be afraid to reuse effective components of sessions. For the first couple of years of my coaching, I thought I had to have something brand new every single week. I absolutely didn't. That was a quick way for me to kind of help myself experience and see what worked, what didn't work. But if you find something that works, don't be afraid to reuse it. Chances are, if it works with one group, it'll probably work with another group, and it might be quite successful in delivering whatever the coaching points are you're trying to get across. I wanted to include a little science just because Eunice included plenty of science last week and I wanted to look like I knew what I was talking about. So basically this, I was going to put something together on my own, but I did discover that this existed on the internet. Source isn't 100% credible, it's iSport360. So basically the idea here is that on your y-axis, you've got the percentage of technical versus tactical training. And then on your x-axis, you've obviously got their age group. So essentially what appears under this blue line is technical training and above is tactical training. So you can see right up until about U11, technical training takes the bulk of the time. And then after U11, tactical training actually takes over. So again, I would say technical is your correct soccer movements. So it's not passing in lines, but you can kind of challenge the players in a game related scenario to get those techniques down. And again, tactical doesn't necessarily mean your X's and O's, your formations. So if I hop to the next slide, I would say that your technical training is the what. So those are the soccer movements you're doing. Is it passing? Is it shooting? Is it dribbling? But your tactical elements, so past the age of U11, you want to put more context around it. So you're telling the player why they're doing what you've told them to do and how they can do that. So you're giving them as many options and kind of increasing their soccer IQ past the age of 11 so that they begin to understand why they're doing what they were told to do, essentially. So at those younger age groups, they don't need as much explanation or context. Absolutely drop it in because you can't just go from 0 to 100. But it's not as complex, obviously, at U11 and under. So the cool down, the what of a cool down, it's basically a gradual reduction in intensity, returning your body to regular heart rate and temperature, stretching, communication, and hydration. So why on earth do we need to do it? I wish I could tell you why we're so negligent to do it, but I can't. Even myself, I don't always do a cool down and I really, really should. So you do cool downs, especially with older players. So once you're reaching that kind of puberty plus age, you really, really have to be cognizant that their bodies are not as flexible, not as supple. They don't bounce back as quickly as the younger players. So it prevents DOMS, which are delayed onset muscle soreness. So anybody above the age of probably 25 on the call, you probably know exactly what I'm talking about. You've gone for a run for the first time in 6 months, maybe in the middle of the pandemic, you decided to go for a run or do a boxer workout. This is not me speaking from experience. And you wake up the next day and you're just aches and pains for about 2 days after. You barely get up and down the stairs, that kind of thing. So that's what we're trying to prevent. So through a cool down, you're removing the lactic acid, you're preparing for the next performance or training. It is a great opportunity to reinforce learning. So again, like the warm-up, you've got your players there in a group. You can have them be social. You can kind of go through what you plan to do in the session if it's a warm-up, or if it's a cool down, you can go over what you've already done in the session and see what the players have actually picked up. So it's a really good kind of barometer to let you know if what you're thinking you're coaching is actually getting through and if what you think you're saying is being received in the same way. And then finally, to build rapport and enable relationships. So again, once you're done your reinforcing of the learning, you can kind of have jokes with individual players. This is your opportunity to connect with the players, but also to enable them to all kind of have a laugh, connect with each other, right? I'm not sure what this will look like whenever we do get back on the pitch with all the various protocols and such, but don't overlook it because it's a really, really valuable part of the session and probably doesn't get the respect that it should. Okay, so those are all the components of a session. Now we'll talk briefly about a SMART session. So anybody that's into goal setting or has had kind of a sniff around anything to do with kind of planning for the future has probably come across SMART goal setting. So in the same vein, we're going to apply the exact same acronym and the same words to the way we design sessions. So when you get into designing a session and you're thinking of the components you can use, I would have this kind of as a prompt for yourself. So if I'm putting together an activity, I want to look at that activity and say to myself, okay, is that specific to the players that I'm going to work with and the context? or even the style of play once we get back into kind of team-based stuff as opposed to group training. Have a look, is that specific? Is it measurable? So I don't expect that you'll be sitting there with a pen and paper or timing the activity or anything like that, but measurable in a sense that you know what you want to get out of it. And at the end of that, can you say, okay, yeah, we got out of it what I wanted to, or I saw this player do this really great thing that I hoped they would. That's the kind of measurable we're looking at. You just want to have kind of a big picture in mind as to what the end result of your session should be. Attainable. So is it development stage appropriate? So if we go out onto the pitch and we see a group of U15, U16 players who are just passing a ball back and forth, have to take a different touch around a cone, facing each other, is that really appropriate for their development stage? Probably not. That would be okay. There's a question. Oh, I cut out. Thank you, Richard. Okay, can you guys hear me?
Yep.
All right, wonderful. I'm gonna get back on my soapbox. Okay, so let me just turn off my iPad. There we go. So I probably got to the attainable level. Was just talking. You want to make it appropriate for their development stage. So if it's older kids, they shouldn't be doing something that's way too easy for them. But at the same time, you don't want to give them something that's totally unachievable. Is it realistic? So this is probably the number one I would stick with. If you had any question to ask yourself, I would really stick on, is it realistic? Timed. So the allocation you want to give within the session. So this all ties back to your organization. Okay. So in terms of some sample questions you could go through, I don't expect that you're going to sit down and design your sessions with all these sample questions, but rather just kind of keep the acronym in mind. But you could say to yourself, what is the big picture desired outcome for the session? How do I introduce the desired outcome and its physical demands? Are the activities development stage appropriate? And does it replicate the game? And how should I organize and allocate my time? Which leads me on to the last part we're going to talk about tonight. So we've got about 9 minutes to wrap up, which should be plenty. So we'll chat quickly about organization and preparation. So a session plan with a known desired outcome is a really nice to have. I know it's not realistic that we're all going to be able to have session plans in hand for every session that is specific and is smart for that session. We've all been put in situations where we get a call a couple hours before, hey, can you cover my session? And you panic and you run to the pitch. You don't even know who you're coaching. You just turn up and hope for the best. That's happened. But I would say organization's your best friend. So anybody who has entered a session disorganized would know that and would feel it. If you're the most organized person on the planet, I wish I could say I was like you. You're very blessed, but take this as a warning that it's not fun to go out into a session and feel like you're not prepared or not organized. So I'd recommend you have a couple of sessions that are really good. I would almost say generic sessions that you could roll out if you are put in that situation. They've got known activities that work, and really you kind of understand the session and you know it like the back of your hand. So I'd recommend you have a couple of those at your disposal for the times when you don't have the time to go through and plan everything. You'd need to know what equipment you need. So balls, bibs, cones, nets. You have to understand the space you've been allocated. So you can't be planning an 11v11 game into your session if you've only got a third of the pitch, that kind of thing. The number of players, and I would highly, highly recommend you have it be plus or minus a few. So many of us have probably been burned by Team Snap, where we go in and we see X number of players and we plan for that for the session. And then 2 minutes before the session starts, you check your phone, 3 people have dropped, and you kind of go, right. So I'd recommend you have that kind of contingency built in to your session, that you'd understand what you would do differently if you don't get the players you're expecting. Pitch setup for flow. So that's between components of your session. So can you flow from your warm up into your first game? Can you set that up ahead of time? Can you put the balls where they need to be for the game? Maybe you send the players away for water between the two parts, and you work with your coaching staff to make sure everything kind of flows nicely. So once you've finished with one element, you can move into the next element, and maybe you clean up that first element and set up the next thing while you're gone. The EAP, which is the emergency action plan, I believe Graham will chat about that next week on the risk management session we'll do. And then support and known roles for your coaching team. So I would really encourage you this year of all years, especially with such a large CIT cohort, you're going to have lots of hands, and it would be really good for the coaching team to know kind of where they fit, how they can help, if they can support and actually lead part of the session. So you break it out into a couple different activities. Who has what responsibility is really, really good to know. So maybe it's arriving 5 minutes before to have a chat about that, but 100% recommended. Organization post session. So this one I've only recently found, and it's really quite valuable. So once you finish up a session, you might have your plan on paper or wherever it is. I'd recommend you get into a practice of actually feedback on your own session. So what went well and what could be improved would be the two things to kind of focus on. So once you roll through and you finish your session, sometimes you'll come out with this buzzing feeling and you go, great, what parts of that really went well? You don't know why necessarily, you just know that it went really well. It could be helpful to sit down and have that kind of thought with yourself a couple hours after, make notes, and then you kind of find what works and can reuse it again. So finding and reusing effective components, and then ultimately you're reiterating and refining. So as you reuse effective components, you can kind of refine them over time. So maybe the whole thing didn't work, but parts of it did, and you want to capture those parts and then try to fix the bits that didn't work. If you don't have that feedback loop with yourself, you'll be missing out on a whole bunch of learning and kind of coach development that you can do for yourself. Okay, so 2 slides left. This includes a couple links that I put in there. So sample session templates. There are any number of sessions out there on the internet. I put the Ontario Soccer grassroots practices as a reference. There's literally, I want to say, close to 300 full sessions on there. Again, that's not what I'm recommending you do at all, but you can definitely go and pick parts of it, create your own versions of what you see on there, study it to figure out why they're doing what they're doing. I've also put in the C license template, so anybody that does plan to get into the community licensing stream, you'll come across that. It's really, that one's just an empty template. It'll give you kind of all the spots you need to put the different components of your session, or DIY. So I think I put one of my own DIY session templates in there, but to be honest, there's not any single session template that I've ever kind of settled on and liked. So if you find one, latch onto it, refine it, and just make sure you know what the most or the non-negotiable parts of your session are. So little cartoon for you, it doesn't matter how many resources you have, if you don't know how to use them, it won't be much use. So ultimately that's the entire message of tonight, is making you understand how to use the resources you've got. And then as a final summary, organization and prep are your best friends. Many sessions will not look like you envision, and sometimes they can be downright funny. There is no shame in pulling an activity if it isn't working, or you're not getting what you want out of it, or the players aren't engaged and they just kind of have gone off and picked daisies instead. There's no shame in calling that part quits and putting them into a game where you can kind of coach them. You can organize their chaos, basically. Find your plan Bs. So again, I'll harp on Team Snap. Attendance is often inaccurate and doesn't necessarily align to your plan when you arrive. So just find your plan Bs for instances like that, whether it's the number of players turning up or whether it's the equipment you have isn't necessarily 100%. You'll probably find through experience, you'll encounter a couple different snafus. and that'll give you the experience that you need to roll out a different response the next time you encounter it, and it'll be like water off a duck's back. Find a template that makes sense for you and refine it over time. Feedback for yourself to reinforce coach learning, and then ultimately your trial and error is better than my plug and play. So you trying something out, you trying a session out, whether it goes 100% or whether it goes 10%, well, it's still better that you've tried it, you've put an intent behind the entire session plan, than me just giving you something and you trying to replicate it, because totally might not make sense to you. And frankly, half of my session plans, if I were to go back and read them, probably wouldn't make sense to me, never mind to you. So very much a moment in time, and can be very, very specific for your set of players. So I would really encourage you to use the resources that are there to test it out for yourself.